Today, again, it feels like I do this program a lot. We're talking about Gettysburg rocks. And, I should mention that I really like rocks on the battlefield. I've always liked the rocks on the battlefield. And, it probably comes from like being a little kid and visiting Gettysburg and climbing in the rocks, and, going through the rocks of Devil's Den, exploring the caves and stuff like that. And I guess I had, as a kid, grown up in an area that didn't have a lot of rocks. So, it's surprising to me. But, I try to tell people rocks were here during the battle. And when you come to Gettysburg and you go around the battlefield, there are very few things that were here during the battle. The houses, obviously, that were standing here at the time. So there are houses that were here during the battle. Some people like to point out the trees, although, I even caught some flack this week for something I said on one of my videos, but I feel like I should explain myself, I do not believe there are a lot of witness trees around the battlefield that are the trees that are here during the battle. But apparently people do. People think there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trees on the battlefield that were here at the time of the battle. And, a couple of things I like to point out is that, most of the trees died in the area after the battle. So the trees that most of these people are pointing out as being witness trees were actually like ones that were grown after the battle, because probably to replace the ones that were died from the battle. So we probably have a lot of trees from the 1870s, but that doesn't make them witness trees. And of course, then what if a tree is 5 years old? Okay, it's like that thin during the battle. Is that a witness tree? And what is a witness tree? So I think obviously they would say, well, they lived at the time and they're still living. And rocks don't live. I don't like that. So I'm starting to call all my rocks witness rocks. So, but yeah, the witness tree people take offense every time I criticize their findings. And then, of course, the main thing that bothers me, and I'm sure some of you have noticed it, is that if a tree appears in a 1940s photograph and it's still standing, that doesn't mean it was standing during the battle. But apparently it does. Okay. Anyway, I love the rocks. I love to touch the rocks. And when I touch a rock, I think to myself, wow, that rock was here, and a Civil War soldier also touched that rock. And of course, when it comes to photography, rocks are very important. Rocks on the battlefield that were there at the time and appear in photographs taken by Matthew Brady or Alexander Gardner. You can find that rock and you can line up the photographs based on the position of the rocks. And many times we would have no idea where a photograph was taken if it didn't have a rock in it. And then in the 1880s and 90s, just the dramatic appearance of Devil's Den was just a magnet for many tourists. And starting in the 1880s, cameramen set up their camera and their wagons at Devil's Den and would just stop tourists and ask if they wanted their photograph taken. And as time went by, people began to realize that there was a professional photographer at Devil's Den. And so families from our area would get in their Sunday best, go to Devil's Den, seek out the photographer, and have a professional photograph of their family taken in front of the rocks of Devil's Den. And because of this, between the years 1883 and 1930, there were some 9 different photographic firms active in the rocks of Devil's Den, and they took some 50,000 photographs of people in front of the rocks. And these are professional photographs as opposed to like somebody just taking, a camera, which was very popular starting about 1910, and getting images on the battlefield themselves. But, and collecting these photographs, examining the details in these photographs, and lining up these photographs is something that I've always been interested in. And since there's so many of these things, you can buy them on eBay, you can buy them in local flea markets, and they vary in price from $5 to $200, depending on how much the person thinks it's worth. And of course, because Devil's Den was a backdrop in many of the photographs, people started carving their name on the rocks or painting graffiti on the rocks. And so, it's fascinating to study the rocks on the battlefield, not just as artifacts from the fighting, but also as, billboards for graffiti. And I should point out that in the early photographs, you can actually see the bullets strikes on the rocks. So what would happen is a bullet would hit the rock, and as the years went by, the bullets oxidized, they turned white, and then as it rains and they weather, the oxidation appears as lines on the rocks. So those lines, the streaks, are from bullets that hit the rock. And I think many people didn't realize that for a long time. And I think some people still laugh when I say that, but it's you can see it on the rocks. Especially, here's a good example. You can see it. Now, the bullets might not physically be there anymore, but the streaks were there for many years for you to see. Now, the rocks on the battlefield, for the most part, we're talking about rocks that, are in a line about a mile wide, and it runs diagonally through the battlefield from, Devil's Den along Cemetery Ridge to Cemetery Hill to Culp's Hill. And this Gettysburg Formation, or sometimes referred to as the Gettysburg Sill, it's primarily York Haven Diabase. That's the name that particular diabase is given. And yes, it runs to York Haven, which is a town along the Susquehanna River, a little northeast of York, Pennsylvania. And this is hardened, molten magma that's been forced up through the center of the earth. And as the softer sediments and soils erode away, the rocks are exposed. And I think this is a great illustration of what we're talking about from a conference done by the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. And you kind of see what we're talking about. And as more and more of the rocks are exposed, they come to rest in these really, really odd positions. And then, the ground under those rocks will erode away, and the rocks will eventually tumble over. But sometimes, it takes a while for that to happen, like millions of years. And according to the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, the diabase was formed 201.2 million years ago. Now, that formation I just showed, of course, is pretty famous and is associated with in its association with the battlefield. Here's an 1866 drawing of that formation. It's from a book by Benson Lossing from 1866. And in it, it's specifically referred to as the Devil's Den. And it is not the Devil's Den. It's a rock formation on the side of a little round top. But what I've come to realize is early on, the name Devil's Den really comes about after the battle, when they're trying to find names for places and associate names with places. And it was John Batchelder who coined the term Devil's Den for that location. But local people were using the term Devil's Den even before the Civil War. But Devil's Den wasn't necessarily used to refer to the formation we call Devil's Den today. Any place where there were large rocks was associated with the devil. And you can see here, this guy was told the Devil's Den was a formation on a little round top. And I'll show you some other places named after the devil in a few minutes. But there's a great letter by a Georgia soldier after the battle. And he's writing about Hood's division attacking Devil's Den. And he apparently got that name from some local person that he encountered. But it's clearly Little Round Top that he's referring to as being Devil's Den. So Devil's Den just is a name that kind of refers to any rocky area of the battlefield. And I'm convinced that Devil's Den comes to us from the Pennsylvania Germans, who were convinced that the devil was placing rocks in their field to mess with them. And in the region, there's all kinds of things named after the devil, and they're usually rocky places. Now, this particular formation, some of you may have watched my recent video, the top 10 rocks on the battlefield. And I tried to explain in that I don't always make up the names for these rocks. Believe me, I enjoy making up names for rocks. But I try to use historic names that were given to these rocks. And this is a Jacob Mumper tourist book. And the copy that I got this out of, I think, was from like 1903. So here is the Curious Rock Formation, listed in a book, by name. And so, it's not something I just made up. Although I think Gary and I popularized the name recently. And here's the same angle. I want you to know that I went down to the side of the hill and took that photograph, so you can enjoy it. I guess I'm a little bit off because you can't see General Warren's statue off to the right. Whoop, that's strange. It jumped ahead a few rocks or a few images. Oh, okay. Yep, there it is. So this photograph is kind of interesting, and this is a postcard that I own. And when I was a kid and I used to buy postcards and images in the flea markets, I used to have to line them up immediately. So I'd get something, it'd have rocks in it, I'd go out on the battlefield, and I'd find the location of the rock. It was just a game that I used to play, or just something I used to do. And this one actually I got when I was older. Sue Boardman got a collection of photographs, and she had a duplicate of this, and she gave it to me. And then Gary and I went out and lined it up. And in this image, I did not know where this image was taken. But after looking for it for a while, I realized that it is taken from the top of the Curious Rocks. So you have to climb up on top of the rocks and then look towards Warren's statue for this image. And I don't know if anybody noticed yet, but there's General Warren. It takes you a while to realize that's General Warren's statue. So you get that would help figure out where the image was if you knew that right away, right? But it's actually, I remember I did it first, and then I challenged Gary to find it, and I didn't tell him where it was. That's what we do too. We're messing with each other. Can you find this image? Can you find those rocks? But again, that image was taken by a cameraman on the very top of that rock, looking back to General Warren. So, people climbed on that rock. That was a very famous rock. And I tell this story often. She has to forgive me if she hears it, but I just saw her like 2 weeks ago. This girl I used to know years ago when I was a teenager, and I was not there, she actually fell off the top of that rock. She fell backwards off the top of the rock, and she was in the hospital for a few months because of it. So kids love to climb on that rock, maybe a little bit too much. And as we said, that rock's going to fall over one day, so they better be careful. Now also, even though we have massive amounts of scientific evidence as to how the rocks are formed, we still have wackos out there, whack jobs. And this guy calls himself a forensic geologist. I don't know what those words mean, but you can find this guy's stuff on the internet, John Anton, and to him, every rock formation is like either placed by aliens or ancient, civilizations. And he has a whole video about this rock talking about how it was like a Stonehenge formed by Native Americans. And so I just put his little summary of it. And I guess if you stand there, it's a window to the spring equinox. thus implying a function as a component of an Archaeo-American calendar system. Yes. So, being interested in Devil's Den and being interested in rocks, I constantly find myself talking to people who have an absolutely different perspective on the subject than me, which I enjoy greatly. So, here's another image that appeared in Benson Lossing's book. It's a pictorial history of the Civil War, and this Gettysburg volume, it's 3 volumes, came out in 1866, and there's these great drawings in it. And he obviously toured the battlefield right afterwards, and then came back, I think like in 1865, and made some drawings. And, this was in that book. And I had the book for years, and, people were saying, well, that doesn't look anything like General Warren's Signal Rock. And, people just assumed that was not an accurate depiction. But, of course, I went out and found it, and it's there. And you can't tell me that's not the exact spot that, he's drawing right there. I mean, he's pretty good. And so this is a rock on the side of Little Round Top associated with General Warren's signal station during the battle. And I don't think anyone else has even considered the fact that this drawing was accurate and was a rock that's there on the battlefield than when I was doing it. And again, I was kind of doing this when I was young, when I was a teenager. Here's another image of a rock. This is from a Matthew Brady photograph, and you might know that eventually they call that the Signal Rock. And today, there's a plaque for the United States Signal Corps attached to the side of that rock. And that rock is, just behind that rock, is the rock that I had in that drawing from Benson Lossing. So I don't think there's any doubt that that's the location of the signal station on Little Round Top on July 2nd. And that's a fact that people had been discussing early on after the battle. Or how would Benson Lossing know about that when he was visiting Gettysburg? Well, I thought I had another one in there. Oh yeah, I did. I just kind of put it in the wrong spot. So of course, this is the rock that is associated with General Warren. And here's a photograph of the Warren Rock prior to the statue being placed. The statue of General Warren was put on that rock in August 1888. So this predates that. And you see there's a stake in front of the rock. And undoubtedly, that's one of the John Batchelor stakes, and they're numbered. And there's a partial list of the numbers on the stakes available in I think it comes from the Huntington Library in California, the John Page Nicholson collection. And you can't really read the number on here, and our partial list doesn't fit in with the list that we have. But it's obviously a stake that was marking something. And maybe it marks the site where General Warren, surveyed the situation on July 2nd. Also, speaking of the area of Little Round Top, we have this formation called the Devil's Kitchen. And again, this term comes from an 1898 William Tipton photograph and a mention in a tour book, a pictorial history of the battle that he wrote. And so this is a formation on the side of Big Round Top. Well, and to give you an idea where it is, Little Round Top would be off to our left, and that's Big Round Top in front of us in this 1885 image. And this area over there is the Devil's Kitchen. You can see we're from the Valley of Death looking to the Devil's Den photographic studio. Devil's Den would be off here to the side, but that is the area of the Devil's Kitchen. And here's a modern photograph from that same image, the location of the same image. And in that image, there were no trees behind these rocks. And my point is that at the time of the battle, I guess I don't have any more. At the time of the battle, this area was open you had a clear view from those rocks towards Little Round Top. And according to William Tipton, there were Confederate sharpshooters in the Devil's Kitchen during the battle. So if you want to, do something for homework, go to the Big Round Top parking lot and walk out the trail to the left from the Big Round Top parking lot that leads down the Devil's Den, and you'll come to the Devil's Kitchen right to this spot and look ahead of the rocks and see all the trees that need to be removed to make it look more like it did at the time of the battle. Of course, that might be another reason why I'm not a witness tree person. I want those trees gone. Okay. But, it's not the only thing named after the devil. We got the Devil's Den. We got the Devil's Kitchen. Here's the Devil's Slipper. And the term Devil's Slipper comes from the Gettysburg National Military Park Commission reports. And I think this one is like 1895, 1896. And it's on South Confederate Avenue, this formation. As a matter of fact, that's a modern photograph I took of it just a couple years ago when we were preparing our museum. That's pretty close. I was pretty close, wasn't I? And it's still there in the woods. You got to see it in the winter off the path. And here it is from the commission report books. See, the Devil's Slipper. Now, or they did the Devil's Slippers. But see how it was originally right on Confederate Avenue? Now it's a few feet back in the woods. We also have the Devil's Bath. And you can see the Devil's Bath is a rock formation in front of Devil's Den. And it's a flat rock with a sort of a depression in it that fills with water. And you can go to any time at Devil's Den and you can splash your hand in the water on that rock. And imagine that the giant snake we call the devil took its bath by sliding through the water in that rock. At least that's what I imagine. And I don't know when it was first called the Devil's Slip or the Devil's Bath. I can't find a reference for it in our local newspaper at all. But Jim Tate, who was a battlefield tour guide for 65 years, I think he was born in 1918, he says when he was a kid, people called it the Devil's Bath. So, take it for what it's worth. And of course, I mentioned we have other devils in our area, like the Devil's Race Course up near Monterey. We got the Devil's Backbone down along Double Pipe Creek or near the Monocacy. I forget, it might be along the Monocacy in Frederick County. So we have other places named after the devil. Now, this is a formation we refer to as the Forbes Rock. And this is from an 1867 image by C.J. Tyson, a stereo image. And it was also recorded, that rock, by Matthew Brady and also by Samuel Weaver. But we call it the Forbes Rock because it appears prominently in a drawing and then later a watercolor by Edwin Forbes, illustrating, you see there's Edwin Forbes, illustrating the attack on the Union position on Culp's Hill. We also have close-ups in 1867 of that rock there and of this tree, although it's not really to scale. I should mention that downstairs we have that diorama of Culp's Hill in our lobby now, and the view of the diorama is this view. So if you go to the diorama downstairs where the miniature soldiers are and look, in the center of the diorama is this particular rock. And the guy did that on purpose to mimic the attack on Culp's Hill by the Southern soldiers from this angle. There's another more modern view of the rock. So you can go down there. And I don't know when the first time I was down there was. This is before my memory. I've always seemed like I've known about this rock. And, I used to go down to it, stand behind it, and look up at the Union breastworks and imagine, the attack on July 2nd. Here's another 1867 view of the rock from a slightly different angle from C.J. Tyson. Whoop, I thought I had another one of it coming up, but and then, like I say, there are Matthew Brady views of the rock and Weaver views of the rock as well. The Sphinx. The Sphinx is interesting. It's an unusual formation again. Soil has eroded, rocks came to rest on rocks below them, and then rocks weathered. And, this thing could have been standing for hundreds of years. I'm sorry, I say hundreds. 100 million years above the surface. And of course, it is no longer there. Here's a photograph that I took of it. I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. It's just always been part of my slideshow. But you can see this is not a rock that we didn't know about or didn't know where it was. This rock is right on the trail on Big Round Top. And when you take the Big Round Top loop trail, as I did in the 1970s, it stops you there. There's a little marker and it says, this is the Sphinx. And the War Department named it the Sphinx in Gettysburg National Military Park Commission report. And there's a photograph of the rock in that report calling it the Sphinx. But I found mentions of this rock in the local newspaper in the 1860s. And they didn't call it the Sphinx, they called it something else. But in one of the earliest examples of political correctness, the park changed the name to the Sphinx. So I'll leave it at that. It was a derogatory term they used. But sure enough, just a few years ago, a friend emailed me and said, hey, I was just out there. I think this Sphinx no longer exists. And sure enough, this photograph is from the same angle. And it got a tree, fell, and hit the rock. And apparently, it was one of those ash trees that had been killed by that ash tree blight a few years ago. Shame we don't have like a biologist at the park that could pay attention when trees are getting ready to fall. That's a joke, because she is a biologist. She doesn't like trees, they're just beavers. So rocks are helpful when you're trying to figure out the development of the park over the years also. Like, this is from the Park Commission book. And I should say, for whatever nerdy reason, when I was a kid, I got a hold of an original copy of the Park Commission reports. And it had all these photographs in it. And I was going around the battlefield lining up these photographs. This is interesting because it says it's Confederate Avenue looking south from near the entrance of Kilpatrick Avenue. And of course, it doesn't take a genius to figure out there is no Kilpatrick Avenue on our battlefield, But there was going to be. And I kind of figured I knew where it was because obviously Kilpatrick Avenue would lead over to where the 8th Vermont Cavalry Memorial is located. And so I had an idea where I thought it was. And so I went into the woods and I lined up these rocks and found this avenue. Now, in more recent years, they tore out. The avenue was replaced in the 1940s by the modern South Confederate Avenue. This is the War Department South Confederate Avenue. And what you learn is that there have been a series of different road systems on our park over the years. There was the original road system put in by the farmers and the early residents. And then there was the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association road system that they put in on the battlefield to get to different places. And then there was the War Department road system. And now we have the National Park Service road system. And each of these roads are at a different location. They don't just build the road on top of the existing road before it. I think that would probably be better for preservation purposes. So the park tore this road out and put in a new road. But then recently, they tore the remnants of this road out and put a horse trail on top of it and covered these rocks up on the left. But you used to be able to go out and stand at that location and see it. Somewhere in my collection, I have a modern photograph. I say a modern, I mean like from the 1980s. And here's that same road along the base of Big Round Top, looking north. And I have lined up these rocks. I remember when I was a kid, of course, I collected postcards, and I found this postcard. And sure enough, this rock is that rock. Whoop, I'm sorry, I'm going the other way. That rock in the photograph from just a slightly different angle. But those rocks are all the same. And I really wanted to know where this photograph was taken. And I searched for a long time before I figured it out. And again, it's because this is not West Confederate Avenue. This is South Confederate Avenue along an old trace of the road that is now the horse trail. But the horse trail goes over here, and these are all covered up by trees and soil now, all these rocks. And here's an image from a quarry on the side of Big Round Top. And of course, it was easy to line up because of that. And we're looking across the area where Farnsworth made his charge on July 3rd. And that little, I don't know if you can see that little road there, that's Kilpatrick Avenue leading out to the 8th Vermont Cavalry Memorial. Let's see, 1st Vermont. Why did I say 8th Vermont? You know, I get the 8th Illinois Cavalry that I think was originally commanded by Farnsworth confused with the 1st Vermont Cavalry. Does that make sense? He's from Chicago, Farnsworth, if you didn't know that. And he has nothing to do with the Farnsworth house, except Loring Schultz decided that he liked General Farnsworth and just named it after him. So I should tell you that one of the reasons I'm into rocks, not only because Robert E. Lee often appears next to me in photographs I have taken in front of the rocks. Gary did that. He thought that was funny. And I think that might have been when he heard my band play our hit song, Lee the Butcher. But my brother and I spent a lot of time on the battlefield then. We're not young in that photograph, but I'd like to come to Gettysburg on weekends when I was a teenager in my early 20s. And so I dragged my brother along, and he had no interest in the battle necessarily, but he liked to, afterwards I would take him to Marvelous Marv's and we'd get the steak special. It was a really good place to go on Sunday afternoon. So we spent a lot of time finding these locations of rocks. Here's kind of an example. I bought this postcard photo view in a flea market, and then I would go out and look for the rock. And it's in front of like the 44th New York monument you can see up there. But again, I had no idea where these photographs were taken on the battlefield. And so I would just start to memorize rocks. I remember this rock, I got this photograph at the Adams County Historical Society. When I started hanging out, at the old dorm of the Lutheran Seminary. And I took it home and I showed my brother, and my brother's like, I know where that rock is. So we would get to the point where we would look at a photograph and know what rock it was before we went out and looked for it. And of course, sure enough, here's my friend Ken Rich making a joke and holding the rock up there. Yeah. And he, one of his friends, I forget who it was, a guy contacts me once in a while and says, hey, I'm the guy that came up with the name for that rock. And I posted it somewhere, like, name this rock. And it was on an old website we used to have, and he won the contest. And so he says that rock is called the Devil's Boner. Maybe that's inappropriate. He still Facebooks me once in a while and say, hey, I'm the guy, remember? I came with that name. So then, of course, later, I think it was 1989, I met Gary. Gary came to Gettysburg, and he came into the store that I worked in Gettysburg, and he told me that he had this rock, and he had a name for this rock. And so we went out and visited his rock with the name. And so then we started hanging out. Gary actually found the location of this image. Now, and then I called Fraz, because I knew William Frassinito, and we came out, and he showed Fraz where it was. And the problem was another person had already found the location of this image. So in William Frassinito's early photography at Gettysburg, Frassinito gives credit to the discovery of this location to another person that showed him before Gary. But Gary found it on his own without any help. And here we are at the location of his discovery. When, you know, Gary, you look at his, I don't even know what you call that, a goatee? And I'm laughing. I'm probably laughing at him. I don't even know who's taking the photograph. And, you know, we admired William Frassinito. I couldn't tell you when I first met him, but it was early on. I think 1980 maybe. Fraz was really into rocks. And we understood, reading his book, which was first published in 1975, that you could use rocks to learn about photographs. Like in this particular photograph, this guy's laying in front of a rock, and there's rocks there, but there was this distinctive rock. And Fraz was able to take 12 photographs, piece them together, make a map of those images, because, you know, he could see the same bodies laying in different directions, make a diagram of where the rocks were, and then he realized that this split rock was the key to this discovery. And then he spent years looking for that particular rock, found that rock, and was able to then tell people that these are dead of, you know, Semmes Brigade on July 2nd on the attack of the Rose Woods. So he's able to put some context to the images and the people in the images. And we have a whole display about this particular find in our special exhibits gallery downstairs, if you want to see that before you leave. But here's a modern image, not at the exact angle. I don't know why I didn't put it at the exact angle, but there's the split rock and this rock I just showed. And here's Bill's original image of this area. And I think it's worth mentioning that because he discovered these photographs in that area, it actually led to Park to take the woods back to the original location where the woods were at the time of the battle. And when Fraz discovered this rocks, it was in the middle of the woods, and the southern end of the battlefield was greatly wooded. So examination of these photographs taken after the battle and understanding when they were taken and where they were taken and the locations helps us if we're trying to restore the battlefield, especially the wood lines, to their historic appearance. And I think that's something that everyone is interested in. So some people mentioned on my top 10 rocks of the battlefield, I did not include the split rock, and boy, did people get angry for me for that. Deservedly so. I just didn't think to include it. Again, it was my top 10 favorite rocks, not the top 10 most important rocks or anything. Gary also was able to discover the location of this top image. William Frassinito discovered the image area also, and we kind of used to have a little contest at who could find the most, sites of photographs. I don't mind telling you Gary discovered this or Gary discovered this, because I discovered a lot more. So I did pretty well too, but he discovered the location of that, and I was very impressed by that. And then, when the park was tearing the woods down near the base of Big Round Top in the slaughter pen at Devil's Den, the park asked William Frassinito if he was willing to help them with this project. And of course, he didn't really want to go out and participate with them in the marking of the area. So he sent me out to do it. But it was based on his research. And you can see this photograph here, and you see he called it the table-like boulder, because it's got a flat surface in one of his books, and you can see that particular rock at the edge of the woods. So knowing where that is, knowing where this is, and knowing in stereo, you can kind of see the tree line starts back there, and you can see some rocks in the tree line. It really helped. Oh, you might notice in this photo of the slower pen, there are other bodies in that image that you can see. And so I participated in the clearing project, and we marked the edge of the woods, and we restored it to more of its appearance. And this particular rock back here, you see that rock, and there's this triangular shaped rock, and you can kind of see it in there. I kind of made a diagram for them, and then I took them to that rock formation and showed them where those rocks were so they could recreate the edge of the tree line. And even made a really neat map that put all our boulders, Anchor Rock, according to Tim Smith, on an official National Park Service map. I showed this to Bill, and all he could say was, "That's my name for that rock." And then also, I'll talk about these two rocks. We have the Troth Rock and the Smiley Rock. They also put on their map. And I just got a big kick out of that when I saw it. Now, there was one day, and I think it was 1992. It's listed in Fraz's book, the date. But I used to collect. It's not enough to look at photographs and books. I collected the original stereo cards of these images. And in stereo, you can really differentiate between the foreground and the middle ground and the background. And I took a series of stereo cards from Culp's Hill out onto the battlefield, and I identified all four of these locations that were unidentified in Frazinito's 1975 Gettysburg: A Journey in Time. And so in the book, he does give me credit for discovering especially this one I was most particularly proud of. That image appeared in Miller's Photographic History of the Civil War, that 1911 10-volume set that I think we have for sale downstairs, an original copy of it for $500, wasn't it, something like that? So you can check that out if you want. But this image I had bought in a local flea market, the original C.J. Tyson stereo on the salmon-covered mount. Yeah, if you want to look for rare stuff, you have to look for the salmon-covered mount, you know. And I took it out, and of course in stereo, I can see that's a long, flat rock, and perhaps I already suspected that maybe that fallen tree on the left of the Edwin Forbes watercolor was this tree. And so I looked exactly where I thought it was, and there were these rocks, and it lined up exactly. So there I am in 93. I think Gary took my picture sitting on those particular rocks. Do you see the formation of the rock in the background that the tree's over and the long flat rock I'm sitting on? And again, you can line them up side by side. You can if you take the stereo out to the rocks, you can see it's the exact site. And also, look at those trees in the background. Do you know literally on Culp's Hill, every single tree died because of lead poisoning from the battle? This photograph is taken 4 years after the battle, and look at all the dead trees. And by the 1880s, Culp's Hill's a field. And there are one or two trees that survived, but not hundreds. So here is a Matthew Brady image. And in this image, I should have put the more inclusive image in it. I discovered the location of this stereo using that rock. But I had a feeling I knew where it was, because cameramen came out, set up their camera, and he usually took more than one photograph of the same location. And I didn't put the accompanying view over, but there's a more expanded version. You can see the Forbes Rock is right here. I should have put that in the program. And then one of my favorite rocks to talk about is the Henry Stort Rock. That's a name I gave it, on the backside of Big Round Top. So here's Henry Stort, and here's a rock. And here's another photograph I later got with a guy standing in front of a rock, and you can see there's a pavilion back there, and in the background a picnic bench. What happened was I realized that Henry Stewart got a job in 1888 at William Tipton's Round Top Park photographic studio. And these were tintypes. I also knew that William Tipton had a tintype gallery at Devil's Den. So I decided one day to just go around to flea markets and gather up tintypes that were taken outdoors. Now, the tintype normally is taken in front of a backdrop. So they have like a screen, like our screen here, and they pull it down and you're at the beach. And then they pull down another screen and you're in the woods. Or they pull down another screen and you're, in front of a building. So I needed it to be a really sunny day and the cameraman say, instead of using the screen, let's take your pictures over here in front of rocks. And then I was hoping to then take those images, go to Devil's Den, and find the location of those images. Well, what I discovered was I found in the process, I found like 20 images that I bought that had people in front of rocks that I suspected were the Gettysburg battlefield. And almost all of them turned out to be on the backside of Little Round Top and not at Devil's Den. And I talk about this in the Devil's Den book where I'm discussing how I did this. But it's a tintype and it's backwards. So I held the tintype, I carried around a mirror, like a lady's mirror like they used when they're knotting the back of their hair in front of the bathroom mirror. And I walked around with this mirror and I looked for the rock. And sure enough, I found this rock. It took me a while. Here I have a couple of different people posing in front of it, but here is Andrew, our director, when he's a little bit younger. He looks really short in that image, doesn't he? But he's at the same location as the guy in the photograph once you reverse the image and you can see the picnic bench. So what I did was I really kind of honed down our understanding of where Round Top Amusement Park was located between 1884 and about 1900. My favorite story to tell about this was I was at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, and my son and I were, just doing our baseball thing. And there was this room called the Negro League. And I walked into it, and here's this image they have on the wall. It was 6 feet tall, the image. It was blown up. And it was a Negro League player from Carlisle and his wife. And I was like, wow, they're at Little Round Top. So I hunted down the archivist of the, Baseball Hall of Fame. And I had this on my phone. And I showed him this and said, hey, look, that's the same rock. This is not Carlisle, this is Gettysburg. And they could have cared less. Or maybe they couldn't have cared less. Maybe that's the expression. They didn't find it interesting at all. But the guy said, I know the guy who owns that photograph and I'll tell him. So they told him, and I got this email. This guy was really excited. And he came to Gettysburg, and he was a big-time baseball collector. He came to Gettysburg, and I took him to Little Round Top, and he stood at that rock, and he just couldn't believe it. And then we did a little research on it later. We found it was a baseball player from Carlisle, and it is in the late 1880s. But I couldn't find an account in the newspaper of that team playing a Gettysburg team. But, it was definitely good stuff. And they changed the plaque at the Baseball Hall of Fame now, and it says the photograph's taken at Gettysburg. And I didn't realize it at the time, but apparently it's a big deal in the Baseball Hall of Fame to get them to change a fact, and they're very, very sensitive about changing their facts on their plaques. I love that. So here's two more, just to give you the idea of what I'm finding. Here's two more images. And, that tree is the same tree that appears in the Henry Stewart image in front of the same rock. And here's some ladies also standing in front of the rock. See the tree trunk there on the left with a weird hole in it? And you can see that's the same tree. And again, I had to get one of Andrew, pretending he was a little girl in that photograph. I love it. And then I did find rocks. I do have CDVs, or tintypes, I should say, of people in front of the rocks of Devil's Den. And there's one of them. And here's two more that I found at Devil's Den. And this rock that they're in front of, and apparently they put a wall of pine branches behind, the group. And then, they used it as a backdrop for images at Devil's Den. Now, also at Devil's Den, we have the Waud Rock. And we call it the Waud Rock here at Devil's Den because Alfred Waud, or, some people like to say his name is Waud. I'm not good at pronunciation, so. But Alfred Waud or Waud got on that rock and he drew an image of the Valley of Death from near Devil's Den. And you can see Devil's Den in the background. And, Gary loves that. This was originally our promotional photograph for our Devil's Den book. You see there's the first edition of Devil's Den. And we were going to use, I don't know why we didn't end up using this in our promotional images. But Gary, he loves, if you ever at Devil's Den with Gary, ask him to do Alfred Waud, and he'll walk over and he'll pose for you. This one, I was very proud of myself with this one. This is a photograph that appeared, I first saw it in Edwin Stackpole's They Met at Gettysburg, which is printed in 1956. And I had gotten it in the 1970s. I like to tell people it was the first serious book I read about the Battle of Gettysburg. I mean, I had read like Bruce Catton's Centennial History of the Civil War that had a little Gettysburg section, or the American Heritage Junior Library Battle of Gettysburg book, or at some point I read The Killer Angels. But this was a book just on the battle, like a serious history, I thought. And in it was one of John White Geary's scouts on the morning of July 2nd on Little Round Top. Wow. That's pretty specific. John White Geary, his men were on Little Round Top on July 2nd. But, it does say as Geary's scout saw. Like, it's not really Geary's scout. And to make the long story short, this photograph was taken in the 1870s. And the Mumpers had hired this guy, or got this guy to dress up in a Civil War uniform, and took him around, and he posed in front of different locations. And there's a whole series of photographs of this guy, but all of them are taken at Devil's Den. And here's Gary pretending he's that guy on that same rock, so. But that's actually Devil's Den looking to Big Round Top, and that has nothing to do with Little Round Top. I remember I was in the Farnsworth House Tavern one day, and Dale Gowan's research assistant came in there, Sam Floka, and he was depressed because they were doing a print on the first Minnesota. And he said from the Minnesota Historical Society, he got a photograph of the members of Company A who led the charge at the scene where they met Wilcox's brigade, and they all lay down at the spot where they were wounded during the fighting. And of course, we don't know which direction the 1st Minnesota charged in or where they made it to. And so, they might be mistaken, but I thought, wow, I'd like to find this location. And Sam Floka said, yeah, I'd like to find it too, because we're going to do a painting of them fighting at location around these rocks. And I wanted to go down there and get a few photographs of it, but I can't find those rocks. As a matter of fact, I'll give somebody $50 that they can find those rocks. I was like, okay. So the next day I went and found those rocks. I don't think I have it in here. Oh yeah, there's Gary laying at the location of where the one guy is laying on one of those rocks. I think he's back here on this rock. And I used that rock to find it. But since then, the Park Service has cleared the Kadori thicket. And now it's not wooded, it's open. But apparently, the Park Service idea of clearing land is to bulldoze it. And I cannot find these rocks anymore. So, bulldozers do a lot of clearing of, let's say this, bulldozers do a lot of restoration of land around the Gettysburg battlefield. Is that a nice way to put it? Probably not. This is one of my favorite rocks that on the battlefield and stories that I discovered. And I put this in my top 10 rocks on the battlefield because I wanted to illustrate, the difficulties. But a lot of people had noticed that at the Adams County Historical Society, they had a William Tipton sample album. And this would be on his desk, and you could page through it, and you could pick out the stereo cards you wanted to order. And one of them was this, a half stereo of the site where Colonel John Wheeler fell on July 2nd. And I went out. What I did is I took a photograph of it from the album, and I went out and found this rock. And at the time, I just was really excited about it. I did a video that we have on our YouTube channel, and maybe it's on the Facebook channel if you put in, if you look on our site and put in Wheeler Rock. And, I do a fade in and out. Andrew actually is the one who came up with the process of, where that rock is with the modern and photographs. But, it always gets me to thinking, we have monuments on the battlefield, but at one time there were signs attached to trees, there were posts that were nailed into the ground, and there were painted rocks that gave you information about the events of the battle. And these are monuments that are no longer there. The only monuments are the ones that that are made of bronze or granite that still exist. And who knows how many types of things like this there were on the battlefield that once told us stories about the battle and where the units fought. The Troth Rock is another rock at Devil's Den that I am enamored with. And the first time I ever met Gary was looking for these photographs that I showed you earlier where the Confederates were at the edge of the woods, and he was convinced that he discovered the location, and this rock was prominently featured in his location, and it definitely was wrong, and I had to be the bearer of the bad news. I'm sorry, Gary, that's not the site. And we've done that to each other over the years, like, you're wrong. And we listen to each other, not like people today when they find a harvest of death and you tell them they're wrong and they don't want to hear it. And, now we have 40 different locations for the harvest of death. But we started calling this the Troth Rock because it had a natural trough in it. And you can see here's a horse drinking water out of the trough. And it's just amazing. And this trough in this rock is associated with the photographic studio run by the Mumper family and later William Tipton at Devil's Den near the Tintype Gallery that I showed earlier. Here's Mike Warwicker got this for me. And this one shows a horse drinking out of the trough. And you can actually see the roof on the right of the photographic studio. So you get an idea where it is. And, later we discovered that there was a pump apparatus behind this rock, and they were pumping water up over into the rock, and it was flowing and filling up the trough. And this is like where the discharge pipe was for the water. And, that rock is still there. You can go out and you can find it. And it's just, again, it's just something I've always been interested in, Troth Rock. And, rocks, like here is the area of the Devil's Den parking lot, a panoramic view by Gardner can really help us when we're trying to, again, figure out where the breastworks were during the battle and where the tree lines were during the battle. So you can see that's the same area. And then there's this rock right before the bridge over Plum Run. And I remember that we spent a lot of time looking for the location of rock photographs on the side of Big Round Top. And it seemed like when we were done for the day and we came walking back to our car over this bridge, we'd stop in front of this rock, and the rock, I imagined, was taunting me and smirking at me because I was defeated in my attempt to find a location. And so I started calling it the smart ass rock. Look how it smiles at you. And what really is interesting, and when William Frassinito's book, Early Photography at Gettysburg, came out, one of the things that he talked about is that you can see this smirking rock. I think he called it the smirking rock and not the smart-ass rock. You can see that this rock is smirking right there, and there's two guys standing in front of it. And when you blow it up, you can see there's a dead body next to this rock. So, and we know that rock is right where the bridge over Plum Run is. The bridge originally built as a carriage road to get to Devil's Den, and then later used as the bridge to get to the bathroom that was torn down in the woods at Devil's Den. And I told the story of the smart-ass rock to the park when they were restoring the area, and so they named it on the rock. They named it on their thing. I guess they were afraid my name, Smart-Ass Rock, might carry on, so they renamed it to Smiley Rock. So I like that people are trying to help me along with my, politically incorrectness. I have lots of weird things happen because people know I'm into rocks. And so I have, friends will contact me. This, I don't even remember the name of the family, but this is a photograph of a guy in 148th Pennsylvania. And he was wounded during the battle. And of course, that unit fought in the wheat field. And the family did a whole video on it about how they found out where this location, this photograph was. And they had it like near the 5th New Hampshire monument in the woods. And I looked at their, they had sent me the image, and I looked at the video, and I was like, well, that's not the rock. And then, of course, I realized he was wounded on July 3rd, and the photograph was taken on September 27th, 1910, the same day of the dedication of the Pennsylvania Monument. So I went to the Pennsylvania Monument, saw this rock, and realized I should lighten this up so you could really see it better, but this is the same rock. And then I was at the visitor center one day, and somebody walked in with this photo. I didn't get a good photograph of it. All I have is this Xerox, but they had the image with them, and their relative was on 155th on Little Round Top, and he was wounded on July 3rd, and he came back in 1913, and he stood at the location where he was wounded. And sure enough, I was able to take this family to that site, find that rock, so they could stand in front of it. And that, people love that. And of course, I put in the program here, the rock in the road. I put this at the end too. I'm not at the end yet, I realize. But you see, the rock in the road. One of my favorite images on the right, that's an 1898 photograph. This is an 1888 photograph. And it was a rock that kind of just sat in the middle of the Wheatfield Road until it was removed by the park around 1900. There's a rock formation that there's lots of photographs of it. It's set somewhere on Wolf's Hill, and it was perfectly balanced. I cannot find this location. I've even found a newspaper article about it. Come to think that rock just no longer sits on this rock, that has fallen off. And that's my issue. But I still haven't located it. It's probably on private property too. When I was a kid, a guy named Jacob Weichert, who lived on Baltimore Street, told me that his father used to work on the battlefield as a park guide, and he would take me around and show me things. And he showed me this rock. It's behind General Warren. So if you go to General Warren statue, turn around and walk back to this rock. It's about 15, 20 feet back. You can push it and the rock wobbles. And he says his father told him that it used to wobble when the wind blew. And now it's kind of unsettled. But you can, if you go back there and try, you can get it to wobble. That's crazy to me. Now also, rocks are interesting because of the carvings or because of the painted graffiti. And you probably know from my Devil's Den book, I'm sure we've all read it, right? That in 1894, the park carefully removed the rock carvings by using a large chisel. That's what they say, carefully removed. Yeah, with a large chisel. And you can see images of Devil's Den with the rock carvings chiseled out. But some of them are still around the battlefield. Augustus Lucian Coble of the 1st North Carolina has his name carved in a rock near Spangler Spring. And here's an image of him from the park library. In the park archives, there's a letter from his son about how he attended one of the reunions and his son carved his name in that rock for him. There's a rock on Culp's Hill that has P. Sachs and A.W. Leitner, 1871, carved in it. Of course, there's a famous carving at the John T. Weichert farm, DA 140 PV. And the story is that David Atchison of the 140th Pennsylvania was killed in the fighting on July 2nd. And his friends after the battle buried him in front of this rock and with a bayonet scratched his initials and unit into the rock. And then later, the family came back, recovered the body, and they made the inscription deeper so that people could visit the location. And I don't know when I first learned of this story. There are stereo cards of this rock that you can find that has the inscription on it early on. And one of our tour guides years ago met up with a family member that had one of these stereo cards and had letters by David Atchison. And she wrote a whole book about this called Inscription at Gettysburg. And it highlights the story of this rock carving. And again, that's one of the lesser visited sites on the battlefield. Of course, there is a carving to where Charles Hazlitt fell on July 2nd on Little Round Top, right behind the monument to the 91st Pennsylvania on Little Round Top. And of course, this one came into controversy recently when the park reopened Little Round Top and he accidentally sandblasted the inscription. We're not going to talk about that. Oh, I should mention, though, that recently the park updated the guide handbook. And the guides are specifically told we're not allowed to point out rock carvings because they are archaeological resources of the park. I never heard such bull crap in my life. But the park is telling me now I can't talk about rock carving. So I will not talk about rock carvings on the battlefield in this program. Okay, so let's talk about more rock carvings. So we got Colonel Strong Vincent fell here. And see how it's spelled C-O-M-G? There's a newspaper article in early 1865 where a visitor goes to Little Round Top and he describes seeing this rock carving on Little Round Top. And he spells it the same way it's spelled here. Not with the backwards S, but C-O-M''G. So this rock carving is probably done in 1864. Colonel Strong Vincent fell here. And, there's a rock carving associated with the 40th New York Volunteers in the Valley of Death near the 40th New York Monument. There's a rock carving near Devil's Den that looks like it's a place marker for the 4th Maine Infantry. And as far as I know, I rediscovered that rock carving in the early 1990s. It had been behind a fence. There was a bush in front of it. They took down the fence. The crew of the USS Gettysburg came to Gettysburg, cleared the weeds around that rock. And I was like, what's that? So, I mean, these things are amazing to me. You might know the Elephant Rock is one of my favorite rocks. In this 1867 photograph, it's called Huge Rock, Foot of Round Top. And you can you see the elephant in the photograph? I guess I'm just used to looking at it. See, that's a big floppy ear, and all over to the right, that's like his trunk. Here's another image of it from a little bit farther back. This is an 1898 image. Now, it doesn't say Elephant Rock, but here is a 1903 tour book. I think this is one of the Mumpers tour books. And look, they call it the Elephant Rock from a different angle. They're using this angle. Can you see the trunk better from that side? And then on top of that rock is a rock carving. David Swope Forney, 1849. I did a whole video of rock carvings at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Daily, if you want to look at it. Some of the videos are disabled on that video, but I had my short pants on because I was climbing up on top of the rocks and showing people where the rock carvings were. And on this rock, there's an American flag. I mean, put an image of it there. And of course, we have the P. Knoll rock carving on top of Devil's Den near Smith's Battery. And there's other carvings that you can almost read under the chisel marks on Devil's Den. And here's one. And, we're always discovering new rock carvings, and there's reasons why. For instance, Little Round Top was wooded, and it was in the early 2000s that they removed the trees from the top of Devil's Den. Do you remember that? And there was this big tree right next to this rock. And because this big tree was next to the rock and blocked the sun, the whole top of that rock was covered with a thick moss or lichen. And then they tore down the tree. I'm sure it's a Civil War tree too. And after they tore it down, the sun hit the rock. And the sun caused all the lichen to die. And a short time later, I'm walking by the side of the rock, and there's a carving on the rock that had been under the moss all those years. And a friend of mine on the internet actually made this highlighted version of the rock carving and put it on the internet. But it's John Houck, May 18th, 1887. I don't know why that date might be important to John Houck. Maybe it's not. Maybe just putting the date of the day he carved his name. But John Houck owned Devil's Den at the time of the battle. And, there are rock carvings on buildings. There's the William J. Slider carving on the Slider House. And here is Henry, I think it's Henry Howard Wirt. J. Howard Wirt was his father, and J. Howard Wirt's aunt married a guy named Gwen who bought the Rose Farm in 1888, and this is on the side of the Rose Barn. And then, there are images we have of rock carvings. This image even is captioned like graffiti on rock above Spangler Spring. And there's even a rock in the background. I can't find this. I've looked for it several times. So, and you can see it's like little, I don't know how they did it. It's like little dots that they carved into the rock. Maybe with a spike of some sort. But I haven't been able to find that one. I guess that's it. I put that at the end. But, hopefully you'll go out on the battlefield and you'll interact with some of these rocks I talked about and, get a deeper appreciation for the witness rocks around the battlefield. That's going to be my new name for the program, Witness Rocks.